The galaxy was dying, and everyone knew it. For 3 long years, the Veltar horde had swept across space like a nightmare made real. Their ships looked like giant crystals, but moved with the hunger of wild animals. 17 star systems had vanished in just the last month. Not conquered, not occupied, completely gone. Where once there had been planets full of life, now there was only empty space and floating rocks. Commander Jamin Park stood in the observation deck of Station Alpha 7, watching the tactical display with growing dread. Each red dot on the screen represented a dead world. Each flickering light that disappeared meant millions of lives snuffed out in seconds. The Coalition forces, made up of 12 different alien species, had thrown everything they had at the Veltar. It wasn't enough, it was never enough. The communication panel crackled to life. Minho, the young officer at the communication station, looked up with fear written across his face. His hands shook as he worked the controls. "Sir, incoming transmission." "From the Rigel sector. It's Admiral Torres." Jamin felt his stomach drop. Torres commanded the Coalition's 3rd Fleet, their strongest fighting force. If something had happened to them, then nowhere in the galaxy was safe anymore. The message came through filled with static and the sound of explosions in the background. Torres's voice was calm, but everyone could hear the defeat in his words. "Command, this is Admiral Torres. All ships lost. I repeat, all ships are lost. The Veltar are adapting to our weapons faster than we predicted. Every time we hit them with plasma cannons, their hulls just absorb the energy and get stronger. Every time we use particle beams, they grow new armor that deflects them perfectly." There was a pause, then Torres continued. Tell them we bought them 3 weeks at most, maybe less. Torres out." The transmission cut to static. In the silence that followed, everyone in the command center just stood there. 3 weeks. That was all the time left before the Veltar reached human space. Captain Sujin Lee had been listening to the whole thing from the briefing room next door. She walked slowly to the main tactical display, her boots clicking on the metal floor. The holographic map of the galaxy floated in front of her, showing the true scope of the disaster. Red zones marked where the Veltar controlled space. The red was spreading like blood in water, consuming everything in its path. Only a thin line of blue remained around Earth and the human colonies, the final defensive line that everyone knew wouldn't hold. Sujin had seen plenty of battles in her 20 years of service, but nothing like this. The Veltar weren't just another enemy species fighting for resources or territory. They were something else entirely. Their ships were alive, growing and changing during battle. They learned from every weapon fired at them and became immune to it within hours. No one had ever seen technology like theirs. Admiral Hansol Kim entered the briefing room, his face grave. He was an old man who had fought in the border wars and survived the Centauri rebellion, but even he looked shaken by what they were facing. "Captain Lee," he said formally, then paused. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Sujin, your ship is our only hope." The UES Defiance was humanity's first and only dreadnought-class battleship. She was massive, over 2 kilometers long, and packed with enough firepower to level a small moon. But she was still just one ship against 1,000,000 alien vessels that seemed impossible to kill. "The planetary defense grid won't be ready for another 6 months, Admiral Kim continued. "Our scientists are working around the clock, but they need time we don't have. If the Veltar reach Earth before then..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone knew what would happen. Earth would become just another red dot on the tactical display. 7 billion humans would join the countless trillions who had already died. Sujin studied the numbers on her datapad. The Defiance carried a crew of 800 people, good people, brave people, who had volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. 800 souls against an enemy that had crushed entire civilizations. The math was simple and terrifying, but as she looked at the tactical display, Sujin felt something stirring in her chest. It wasn't hope, exactly. The situation was too desperate for that. It was something else, something uniquely human. It was the stubborn refusal to give up, even when facing impossible odds. It was the same feeling that had driven humans to cross oceans in wooden boats and reach for the stars in metal cans. The Veltar had never fought humans before. They had crushed species with technology far more advanced than Earth's. They had adapted to weapons that made human guns look like stone axes. But they had never encountered the one thing that made humans different from every other species in the galaxy: the absolute refusal to go down without a fight. The UES Defiance had been traveling through deep space for 3 days when everything changed. Captain Sujin Lee was reviewing maintenance reports in her ready room when the ship's communication system started picking up something that made her blood freeze. The Veltar were talking, and for the first time humans could understand what they were saying. Months earlier, Earth's best linguists and computer scientists had worked day and night to crack the alien language. It had been like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. The Veltar didn't just speak with words. Their communication included energy patterns, chemical signals, and something that the scientists could only describe as living sound. But they had managed to decode enough to understand basic concepts. Lieutenant So Young was the ship's communications officer, a young woman who had studied alien languages at the Naval Academy. She had volunteered for this mission even though everyone knew it was probably a one-way trip. Now she sat at her station, her face pale as she listened to the intercepted transmissions through her headphones. "Captain," she called out, her voice tight with concern. "You need to hear this." Sujin made her way to the bridge quickly. The crew had been on edge for days, knowing they were heading toward an enemy that had destroyed every fleet sent against them. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "What do you have, Lieutenant?" Sujin asked, as she took her captain's chair. So Young's fingers moved across her control panel, adjusting frequencies and filtering out background noise. "I've been monitoring their communications for the past hour. They're talking about us, Captain. About humans." She played back the translated transmission. The computer's voice was flat and emotionless, but the words it spoke sent a chill through everyone on the bridge. "The species that destroyed the harvester pods approaches. The hive is pleased. Finally, a challenge worthy of attention." Sujin felt her stomach drop. 3 years ago, the first Veltar ships had appeared at the edge of human space. They had sent what they called harvester pods, smaller ships meant to test humanity's defenses and gather information about Earth's technology. The human fleet had managed to destroy them, but it had cost hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. At the time, everyone had celebrated it as a victory. Now they realized it had been more like poking a sleeping giant. "They're excited," So Young continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The translation algorithms are having trouble with some of their concepts, but it's clear they see us as some kind of entertainment. They're looking forward to fighting us." Tactical Officer Jin Woo looked up from his console, his face grim. "Captain, long-range sensors are picking up the enemy fleet. You're going to want to see this." The main screen flickered to life, showing a view of deep space that made everyone on the bridge fall silent. The Veltar fleet was massive beyond comprehension. Thousands upon thousands of ships moved in perfect formation, their crystalline, hulls catching and reflecting starlight like deadly diamonds. Each ship was enormous. Some were the size of small cities. Others looked like floating mountains made of living crystal. Sujin had seen the intelligence reports, but seeing the enemy fleet with her own eyes was something else entirely. Each Veltar vessel was larger than any human ship ever built, except for the Defiance itself, and there were so many of them that they seemed to stretch across space like a glittering wall of death. "My God," whispered Navigator Hai-Jin from her station. "How many are there?" Jinwoo checked his readings twice before answering. "Sensors are detecting over 800,000 individual vessels, Captain. And that's just the main fleet. They're a smaller group spread out across a dozen light-years." The bridge fell silent as everyone absorbed that number. 800,000 ships. The entire human fleet, every military vessel, cargo ship, and civilian transport combined. Numbered less than 50,000. They were outnumbered more than 16 to 1. "Ma'am," Jinwoo continued, his voice steady despite the impossible odds they faced, "enemy fleet has changed course. They're no longer following their previous trajectory toward the outer colonies. They're heading directly for the Sol system." Sujin felt her heart skip a beat. The Sol system meant Earth, home. 7 billion people who were counting on ships like the Defiance to protect them. Navigator He Jin was already working at her station, calculating intercept courses and travel times. Her fingers flew across the controls as she ran dozens of different scenarios. "Captain, if we push our engines to maximum power, we can intercept them at the edge of the Kepler system. That would put us about 30 light-years from Earth." She paused, looking up at Su Jin with troubled eyes. "But Captain, if we engage them there, we'll be completely cut off from any reinforcements. The nearest human fleet is 6 days away at maximum speed. It would be a one-way trip." Su Jin looked around the bridge at her crew. These weren't just sailors following orders, they were volunteers who had chosen to be here. When Earth Command had asked for volunteers for this mission, they had been honest about the odds. Everyone knew they probably wouldn't be coming home, but 800 people had stepped forward anyway. Chief Engineer Dong Hyun spoke up from his station. "Captain, the engines can handle maximum power for about 12 hours before we risk a core breach. After that, we'll be running on backup. Systems." Weapons Officer Min Jun nodded grimly. "All weapon systems are at full capacity. We are carrying enough ammunition for a sustained battle, but against numbers like these—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the math. Su Jin stood up from her captain's chair and walked to the main screen. The Veltar fleet glittered in the darkness like a constellation of death, moving with purpose toward everything she had sworn to protect. Behind her, she could feel the eyes of her crew watching and waiting for her decision. "Navigator," she said quietly, "plot the intercept course." He Jin's hands hesitated over her controls. "Captain, are you sure?" "Once we commit to this course—" "I'm sure, Lieutenant. Plot the course and prepare for maximum engine power." Su Jin turned to face her crew, her voice carrying to every station on the bridge. "It's time to remind the galaxy what humans do when we're cornered. We don't run. We don't hide. We stand up and fight." The Defiance shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system. What Captain Su Jin Lee saw through the main view screen made her heart sink into her stomach. Where 2 thriving human colonies had once existed, there was nothing but floating debris and chunks of rock drifting through space. 6 million people had called this system home just days ago. Now there wasn't even a trace that they had ever existed. "Sensors detect no life signs," reported Lieutenant Yuna, her voice barely above a whisper. "The planets— they're gone, Captain. Completely gone." Su Jin stared at the destruction in disbelief. She had seen war before, had witnessed the aftermath of orbital bombardments and planetary invasions, but this was different. This wasn't conquest or occupation. This was total annihilation. The Veltar hadn't just destroyed the colonies, they had erased them from existence as if they had never been there at all. "How is this even possible?" muttered Chief Engineer Dong Hyun, looking at his readings with confusion. The energy required to completely disintegrate 2 entire planets. It should be impossible. Before anyone could answer, the communication system crackled to life. The voice that came through the speakers was unlike anything the crew had ever heard. It sounded like a mixture of wind chimes and grinding metal, with undertones that seemed to vibrate through their bones. The ship's translation computers worked frantically to convert the alien sounds into something humans could understand. "Unknown vessel," the translated voice said with an odd mechanical cadence. "You pilot the largest ship of your species. The Hive acknowledges your presence. State your purpose before termination begins." The bridge fell completely silent. Everyone turned to look at Captain Su Jin, waiting for her response. Through the view screen, they could see the massive Veltar fleet hanging in space like a wall of glittering death. Hundreds of thousands of crystalline ships, each one pulsing with an inner light that seemed almost alive. Su Jin stepped forward, her mind racing. She had studied every available report on Veltar tactics and behavior during the long journey to this system. One thing had stood out from all the intelligence briefings. The Veltar seemed to have some kind of honor code, something that resembled the ancient warrior traditions found in many human cultures. "This is Captain Lee of the United Earth ship Defiance," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the bridge and into space. "I invoke the ancient right of single combat. Your largest ship against mine. Winner takes all." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an ancient arena. The bridge crew stared at their captain in shock. Even Chief Engineer Dong-hyun looked up from his console with surprise written across his face. Commander Seung-ho, Soo-jin's executive officer and oldest friend, stepped closer to her. "Captain," he whispered urgently, "what are you doing? We can't possibly win a one-on-one fight against their biggest ship." Soo-jin didn't take her eyes off the viewscreen. "Maybe not," she replied quietly, "but I'd rather go down fighting one ship than get torn apart by 800,000 of them." The silence stretched on for long minutes. The crew could only wait and wonder what the alien hive was thinking. Were they conferring among themselves? Were they laughing at the audacity of this tiny human ship, challenging their entire fleet? Finally, the alien voice returned, and there was something different about it this time. Something that almost sounded like amusement. "Your customs are interesting, small ship captain. The concept of individual combat is unfamiliar to the hive, but it has merit. Your challenge is acknowledged and accepted. Prepare for termination." As soon as the transmission ended, the massive Veltar fleet began to move. The crystalline ships spread out into a wide circle, creating an arena of sorts in the empty space where the human colonies had once been. From the center of the formation, one ship began to separate from the others. "Dear God," breathed Navigator Hyejin as the enemy vessel came into view. The Veltar champion was enormous, easily twice the size of the Defiance, and possibly 3 times as massive. Its hull wasn't made of metal like human ships, but appeared to be some kind of living crystal that pulsed and shifted with organic light. Strange patterns moved across its surface like veins carrying luminous blood. The ship didn't just look alien. It looked alive, as if it had been grown rather than built. "All stations combat alert," Soo-jin announced, her voice calm despite the impossible odds they faced. "This is what we came here to do. Let's make it count." Red warning lights bathed the bridge as the crew prepared for battle. Weapon systems came online, shields powered up to maximum, and damage control teams took their positions throughout the ship. "Tactical, load the main guns with tungsten shells," Soo-jin ordered. "Engineering, I want every reactor at maximum output. We're going to need every ounce of power we can get." Weapons Officer Min-jun looked up from his console with confusion. "Captain? Shouldn't we use plasma cannons? Our energy weapons have much better range and penetrating power. The tungsten shells are they're just chunks of metal." Soo-jin smiled grimly. "Negative, Lieutenant. Old-fashioned kinetic rounds only. No energy weapons at all." "But Captain," Min-jun started to protest. "Trust me on this," Soo-jin interrupted. "Every report we've received says the Veltar adapt to energy-based attacks. Their hulls learn to absorb or deflect plasma, particle beams, and laser fire. But nobody has ever mentioned them adapting to good old-fashioned projectiles." As the alien ship approached, its crystalline hull began to shift and change. Patterns of light raced across its surface, and the crystal structure itself seemed to reorganize. The ship was preparing for battle, expecting to face the same kinds of energy weapons that had failed against Veltar forces throughout the galaxy. What it wasn't prepared for was humanity's most ancient form of warfare: throwing rocks. Very fast, very dense, very destructive rocks. The distance between the two ships closed rapidly. The Veltar vessel was beautiful in a terrifying way, like a living jewel the size of a city. But Soo-jin had learned long ago that in space combat, beauty meant nothing. Only firepower and tactics mattered. "Range 200 kilometers and closing," reported Jin Woo from Tactical. Soo-jin gripped the arms of her captain's chair. "All hands, prepare for combat. Today we find out what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object." The moment of truth came faster than anyone expected. The Defiance's main guns roared to life, sending the first tungsten shell screaming through space at incredible speed. The projectile was nothing fancy, just a dense chunk of metal accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed by the ship's magnetic rail system. Simple physics, the kind humans had understood for centuries. The shell hit the Veltar ship's crystalline hull and punched straight through it like a hot knife through butter. The alien vessel shuddered from bow to stern, its beautiful bio-crystalline armor suddenly looking a lot less impressive, with a gaping hole torn through its center section. "Direct hit!" shouted Weapons Officer Min Jun from his tactical station, his voice filled with disbelief and excitement. "Their hull integrity is dropping fast. Whatever that armor is made of, it can't handle kinetic impact." Captain Sujin felt a surge of hope for the first time since this battle began. Through the main view screen, she could see the massive alien ship staggering in space like a wounded animal. Strange lights flickered across its hull as it tried to repair the damage, but the hole remained stubbornly open. The Veltar ship wasn't giving up, though. Its response came quickly and violently. Energy weapons erupted from dozens of points along its hull, sending streams of superheated plasma and particle beams toward the Defiance. The space around the human ship lit up like a deadly fireworks display as the alien weapons tried to find their target. But helmsman Junseo was ready for them. His hands moved across his controls like a pianist playing a complex piece, sending the Defiance into a series of evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible for a larger, less maneuverable ship. The Defiance twisted and rolled through space, using the debris field from the destroyed colonies as cover. Using the asteroid fragments as shields, Junseo reported, sweat beading on his forehead from the concentration required. "Their energy weapons are hitting the rocks instead of us." It was a dangerous game they were playing. The debris field was all that remained of 2 human worlds and 6 million people. Now those same fragments were helping to protect the last human ship in the system. There was something poetic about it, the dead helping to defend the living. "Ma'am," called out sensor operator Yuna, her voice tight with excitement, "I'm reading massive communications traffic from the enemy fleet. The Veltar ships are transmitting to each other constantly. The computer is having trouble translating it all, but from what I can make out, they seem confused." Sujin wasn't surprised. For thousands of years, the Veltar had perfected their technology against energy-based attacks. Every species they had encountered used plasma cannons, particle beams, laser arrays, and other advanced energy weapons. The Veltar's biocrystalline hulls had evolved to absorb, deflect, or adapt to these attacks within minutes of first contact. But humanity's approach was so basic, so primitive, that the alien technology had no idea how to handle it. The tungsten shells weren't energy that could be absorbed or deflected. They were just solid matter moving very, very fast. When they hit something, they made a hole. Physics didn't care how advanced your armor was. "All weapons, continuous barrage," Sujin ordered. "Don't give them time to figure out a defense." The Defiance's guns opened up with everything they had. Tungsten shells, depleted uranium rounds, and even old-fashioned explosive warheads streamed toward the alien ship in a constant stream of destruction. Each hit caused more damage, and the Veltar vessel's attempts to repair itself were falling behind the rate of incoming damage. The alien ship tried to close the distance, hoping to use its superior size and firepower in close combat. But every time it moved toward the Defiance, Junseo would send their ship dancing away through the debris field, always keeping just out of reach while the guns continued their deadly work. Chief Engineer Donghyun's voice crackled over the intercom from the engine room. "Captain, we're running hot down here. The reactors are at 110% capacity, and the magnetic rail systems are drawing more power than they were designed for." Sujin made a decision that surprised everyone on the bridge. "Chief, prepare for ramming speed. I want every ounce of power you can give me pushed into the engines." Donghyun's voice came back filled with shock. "Captain, the structural integrity of the ship won't hold up to a direct collision with something that size. Will be torn apart." Sujin stood up from her captain's chair and walked toward the main view screen. The alien ship was massive and beautiful, but she could see the damage they had inflicted. Holes dotted its crystalline hull, and parts of its structure were already beginning to collapse. "The hull will hold long enough, Chief," she said calmly. "This is how humans fight. We don't just defeat our enemies, we make them afraid of us. We show them that we're willing to do whatever it takes to protect what we love." Commander Seung-ho stepped up beside her. "Captain, are you sure about this? There has to be another way." Sujin smiled grimly. "Sometimes the simplest approach is the best approach. The Veltar have spent millennia learning to counter advanced technology, but they've never faced an enemy crazy enough to just ram them." The Defiance began to accelerate directly toward the alien vessel, her guns still blazing. The tungsten shells continued to tear through the Veltar ship's hull, each impact causing more structural damage. The alien vessel tried to bring its own weapons to bear, but the angle was wrong, and most of its shots went wide. As the distance closed, both ships grew larger and larger in each other's view screens. The crew of the Defiance could see details. On the alien hull, strange organic patterns, pulsing lights, and what looked like living tissue growing between the crystalline sections. "Impact in 30 seconds, called out Navigator He-Jin. "All hands brace for collision," Sujin announced over the ship-wide intercom. "This is going to hurt." The two ships came together with an impact that lit up space like a newborn star. The collision was so violent that it sent shockwaves through subspace that could be detected from 3 star systems away. Both vessels shuddered and groaned as metal met crystal, and for a moment it seemed like both ships might tear themselves, apart from the impact. But when the light faded and the debris settled, one ship was still moving and the other was drifting dead in space. Against all odds, the Defiance was still alive. The massive impact with the Veltar mothership should have destroyed both vessels completely, turning them into nothing more than floating debris in the cold darkness of space. But somehow, Captain Sujin's battered warship had survived the impossible collision that everyone thought would be her final act of defiance. The ship was in terrible condition. Long cracks ran across her hull like spider webs, and atmosphere was hissing out of dozens of holes where the alien weapons had torn through her armor. Emergency lights flickered throughout the corridors as damage control teams rushed to seal the breaches before they lost all their air. The engine room was filled with smoke, and half the weapon systems were completely offline. But incredibly, miraculously, the Defiance was still flying. The Veltar mothership that had seemed so invincible just moments before was now a drifting wreck. The crystalline vessel that had shrugged off every human weapon was dark and silent, tumbling slowly through space with massive sections of its hull missing entirely. The collision had done what all their missiles and energy beams could not. It had actually hurt the enemy. "Captain," Communications Officer Min Ho called out, his voice filled with complete amazement. "We're receiving transmissions from the enemy fleet. You're not going to believe this, but they're actually retreating." Captain Sujin dragged herself to the viewport, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Her entire body ached from the impact, and she could taste blood in her mouth, but she had to see this with her own eyes. Through the cracked glass, she watched in stunned silence as hundreds of thousands of crystalline ships began to slowly withdraw from human space. The sight was almost impossible to process. For months, these alien vessels had swept through the galaxy like an unstoppable force of nature, destroying everything in their path without ever showing the slightest hesitation or fear. They had wiped out entire civilizations, reduced mighty fleets to scrap metal, and conquered worlds that had stood for millions of years. Nothing had ever made them retreat before. "They're transmitting on all frequencies," Communications Officer So Young reported, her fingers flying over her console as she worked to decode the alien signals. "I'm translating their message now. It says, 'The small ship species fights beyond. Logic, retreat, adapt. Return when understanding is complete.'" Commander Seung-ho managed a grim smile despite the pain from his injuries. "They're actually afraid of us, Captain. After everything they've seen and conquered, they don't understand how we fight. They can't figure out why we keep attacking, even when we know we can't win." Captain Sujin felt a surge of pride mixed with exhaustion. She activated the ship-wide communication system, knowing that her words would be recorded and remembered long after this battle was over. Her voice was hoarse and tired, but it carried the strength that had kept her crew fighting against impossible odds. "All hands, this is the captain speaking. Today we learned something very important about ourselves and about war itself. It doesn't matter how advanced your enemy is, how many ships they have, or how perfect their technology might be. What truly matters is what happens when someone threatens your home, your family, and your entire species. When that moment comes, you have a choice. You can surrender and hope for mercy, or you can stand up and fight back with everything you have." She paused, looking out at the retreating alien fleet that stretched across the stars like a glittering river of crystal and light. The sight would have been beautiful if it weren't so terrifying. These creatures had the power to destroy entire solar systems, but something about humanity's desperate resistance had made them hesitate. The Veltar will be back someday, Sujin continued, her voice growing stronger. They'll spend years studying what happened here, analyzing our tactics and preparing better weapons and strategies. But when they return, they'll remember this day. They'll remember that humanity doesn't surrender easily, doesn't give up when things look hopeless, and doesn't go quietly into the dark. They'll remember that even when we're outgunned and outnumbered by millions to one, we still find ways to hurt them. The message was automatically broadcast across the galaxy through the emergency communication networks that connected all the surviving colonies and refugee camps. On dozens of worlds where alien survivors had been hiding in caves and underground bunkers, afraid to even dream of freedom, people looked up at the stars with something they hadn't felt in years: genuine hope. In refugee camps scattered across the Outer Rim, families who had lost everything to the Veltar invasion gathered around communication devices to hear the incredible news. Children who had never known anything but fear and hiding listened as their parents explained that somewhere out there, someone had actually stood up to the monsters and lived to tell about it. The story spread from planet to planet, carried by traders and refugees who whispered it in hidden meeting places and underground shelters. A single human battleship, badly outnumbered and fighting alone, had somehow managed to hold the line against an enemy that had never been stopped before. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was undeniable. The Veltar fleet was actually retreating. Captain Sujin and her crew had done more than survive an impossible battle. They had given the entire galaxy something precious that had been lost for far too long. Proof that the Veltar could be fought, could be hurt, and could be forced to retreat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to light a spark of resistance that would spread across the stars. The lone human battleship had held the line, and in doing so had reminded everyone that sometimes the most important victories come not from winning, but from refusing to lose.